Hello and welcome. We are your hosts Sandesh and Anshuman. In each episode, we will pick one seemingly boring security topic and talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between. So join us for some fun, some conversations, and some super hot takes about all things security in the Boring AppSec podcast. All right, so welcome to episode 2 of the Boring AppSec podcast. Anshuman, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Sandesh?
Not too bad. It's been a bit of a busy week, but it's always busy, right? I kind of wanted today to talk about a post you wrote, I think in 2022. It was one of your really long posts on building a product security program from scratch. I know I read that and I really enjoyed it, especially because October 2020 is when I joined Razorpay as a security engineer. I'd kind of gone through some of the journey that you're talking about, and I was still going through some of the other things that you were talking about, right? So I remember reading that and going, man, this is so helpful, right? And then it kind of blew up. I know it was, it kind of featured on a bunch of newsletters as well. And in general, I think it was kind of very a useful, post. So what I thought we should do today is if you can kind of not like walk through the blog per se, but just talk about that topic, right? And pick up pieces from that post are still relevant, which I think it's a timeless piece. So I think most of it's going to be relevant. And if there are some aspects which have changed over the last 2 years or some things to think more about now, we could talk about that as well. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So before we start, that blog's on anshumanbhartia.com. And the title is Building a Product Security Program from Scratch. We'll link it from the show notes. Yeah, so just to kick things off, tell us, right? So when you start a product security program, what's the first thing that comes to your head? How are you thinking about it kind of the day you start or a few weeks before you start, right? How do you start?
Yeah. So actually, before I start answering this, I think the title of the podcast was supposed to be First Security Hire, but I think whatever I'm about to explain, it kind of applies to all programs. I just want to say that it's not just scope to a product security program. I might go over some things that are product security specific, but I think the general idea applies to pretty much every program. So I think as a first security hire, if you are asked to build a program, whether it is product security or something else, where do you start? How do you approach this? And, how do you even know what to do? So really, like if you go through my blog, it's a pretty long blog, but if I were to sum it up, in like a small gist or like summary, I think there's basically a few key things to keep in mind. Well, first thing is understanding the organization, right? Like every organization's risk appetite is different. Their industry is very different, right? Like I could be working in a healthcare industry, you could be working in a financial industry. So the risk appetite, the attack vectors, everything varies significantly from company to company. So I think as the first security hire, it is really important to understand what is it that you're trying to protect, what is it that your organization really cares for, right? And what is it that will make sure that you're making meaningful progress, right? So understanding the organization, its priorities, right? How does engineering work? What kind of projects are being worked on, so on and so forth. What are some key things that the top C-level executives want the folks to work on, right? So I think that is really the first key aspect that I think is important. If you want me to pause, I can pause, or if you have any thoughts, questions.
So I think you raise a really interesting point, right? And I think I'll just take a slight diversion here. I think, we talk about security culture a lot, right? In general, in the security industry, we talk about security culture a lot. And, to me, it's basically downstream from org culture, right? So you can talk about a lot of security things, but if it doesn't map with your organization, it just doesn't work, right? So, Andrew Breitbart has this quote, forget the political stuff, right? I mean, we can ignore that. But he says politics is downstream of culture, right? Which I think is like a really interesting way of looking at it. So I think the security version of it is like, security culture needs to be downstream of org cultures, right? So if your security culture doesn't align with your organization, it doesn't really matter. So from that perspective, you're absolutely right. You may have had success working in an ops-heavy financial global company, and then if you move into a startup, which is one location with one office in Silicon Valley, and they're tech first and they're move fast and break things, the same things don't apply, right? I mean, I'm not picking one over the other, but I'm just saying the security culture has to change as well. So I 100% agree with you, on understanding kind of what the org is about and then thinking about security. So just wanted to say I agree with you. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I've also worked at place, and I've also seen uh, the fact that security culture could be different from the overall organization culture. But I think the real impact, or if you want folks to like see you as you are basically helping them solve important issues, I think it is important to align the security culture along with the organization culture, right? Like, I've seen security teams do things slightly different, and more often than not, those things end up causing friction, right, in the long run. So, yeah, just something to be aware of, just like something to be careful is, yeah. Just making sure the cultures align, and you're speaking the same language with everybody else. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So that was the first thing, right? First aspect. The second aspect that I covered in my blog is building relationships.
Hmm.
And by building relationships, what I mean is, you're the first hire, right? Apart from understanding what the organization is about, right? I think the next most important thing, even before you could go and start applying solutions or building things, is to sort of build these relationships with different sort of folks within the company, right? What I mean by that is, there could be an engineering manager of a team that is working on iOS applications, right? There could be an EM working on something significantly different, right? So I think sort of building those relationships, being comfortable having those conversations, being able to ask questions like what keeps you awake at night, what are some top security priorities, what are some failures that you've seen, and how can security help, right? So I think keeping your door open and building those relationships with these folks really go a long way, because if folks work with you, or if they just see you that you're showing interest and you actually want to help, I think that is really helpful, as opposed to you are the first hire and you just start working in a silo. You
Hmm.
identify a problem and then you think of an idea and then you just go and try solving it. If you don't bring everybody along with you on this journey, if you don't make sure the engineering has agreement with whatever you're working on, more often than not, the adoption of whatever you're building is going to suffer huge, right? So yeah, I think building relationships is very important.
Yeah,
Any
I think you're right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think to me, security is this weird thing where a lot of the implementation is engineering stuff, but essentially it's a risk management function, right? So
Yeah.
understanding risk is kind of key. So in general, I really enjoy I really enjoyed conversations with non-engineering, non-tech folks in a company and asking their opinion on risk, right? So if you go talk to the CFO of the company, or someone who manages finance, or whoever manages money in the company, right? Their perception of risk is going to be very different from
Mhm.
from your pen tester's perspective of risk, right? But I think it's important to understand that, because in the end, security doesn't survive, the company doesn't survive, right?
Yeah.
So I think it hit the nail on the head. Like, just general stakeholder management is something that's really important. The only point I'll add is that don't stop with like the engineering layer. I understand that
Mhm.
most of the work you do as a first hire, especially, it's probably going to be
Mhm.
at the engineering layer anyway. Maybe a little bit of legal compliance stuff. I know we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, I would say expand beyond engineering as well, and then talk to as many people as you can. A little
Yeah.
hard if you're like an introvert. I kind of enjoy doing that. I really love that process. But in general, I
Yeah.
think really good to talk to everybody you can.
Yeah. Also, to add to that, I think one example I also added in my blog is, if you are the first hire and if you're looking to build these relationships, one quick and easy way, and actually a practical way, is to get involved in an ongoing project. So let's say an engineering team is trying to ship a feature that you're supposed to make sure it is safe and secure. So why not get involved in their Scrum calls? So, why not try to understand how they're actually building and shipping stuff, right? So I did that in one of my previous workplaces, and I think that really helped me build empathy. Empathy is what I'm looking for, right? Like, couldn't just go and ask folks to start working on things that they didn't care about. So I had to first understand what their struggles are, what they wanted to achieve, and then sort of figure out how I could approach what I needed, right? So yeah, I think that's also important to bring up, is sort of being more proactive and showing interest in projects, and not just going after what you want to work on. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I ask you a question there? I mean, often we hear about this whole security versus engineering, security versus developer things, right? In your experience, how receptive are engineering teams to kind of include security in their in their
Mhm.
sprints, right? Are they like, man,
Mhm.
this guy's going to come in and
Mhm.
make us focus on stuff that we really don't want to focus on? Were they welcoming?
Mhm.
Like, what was your
Mhm.
experience?
Yeah, that's a very great question. I think I've had different kinds of experiences, to be honest, but for the most part, I'm generally met with some skepticism, right? Like, why is this security person wanting to join a scrum calls? Like, what is going to happen? Is this security person going to add more work on our plates? Is he going to ask us more questions? But like once I join one call and I just keep quiet, right? I think the intention with which I join is to just observe, right? I will have questions, but I tend to just kind of keep my questions to myself in the beginning, and only when I feel confident that if I'm asking questions, I've actually gone and done my homework, my research, I understand what am I asking about, right? So I think that's is important, and I think that feel of comfort, right? And I think is what I meant by building relationships, right? Yes, like the first instance, you are gonna meet with some skepticism, some friction, but I think if you keep at it and if you just try to show that you're in it with good intentions, I've almost had success all the time. For the most part, yeah, I hardly remember any instance when I wanted to join a scrum call or when I wanted to be involved in a project and the engineering team said no. They
Yeah.
always want help, right? So yeah, that's my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, right? It's also kind of, the advantage here is you need like one team to say yes, right? So if you
Right.
have 10
Yeah.
teams and then you ask all of them and 8 of them say no, it's still a success because you have 2 teams who said yes, right? So that
Yeah.
way, you just need to find that one champion in general who can kind of
Yeah.
take a bet on you. And then if you
Yeah.
do well and if you're actually helpful, then that reputation travels, right?
Yeah.
And then it's
Yeah.
easy to kind of do that. Okay, no, that's really interesting. Okay, so you kind of you join the company, you understand the company culture, you build relationships with some stakeholders. Hopefully, the relationship takes you into getting your hands dirty with an engineering project. What next?
Yeah, so I think these two, understanding the org and building relationships, were like the things that I focus on my blog. Obviously, once you have a good understanding of the people, the processes, and just kind of the tools, I think the next step in my book is to figure out how or what are you going to work on in the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, right? So I think building some sort of a roadmap, or at least laying out your plan out there so that others can see and give you feedback, or ask you questions, becomes important. So like, what do you do in the next 30 days, right? So at that point, I think it kind of really depends on your initial reconnaissance, right? Or at least your initial communications that you've had with different teams, right? One thing that I tend to go for is kind of an asset inventory, which we spoke in the first episode, right? But if the organization is already slightly mature, if they have like a good way of figuring out what the assets are, you could be focusing on something else. So I think that tends to be my approach. The other thing that is worth mentioning is compliance plays a big role in these first security hire responsibilities, right? More often than not, what I've seen is when companies are trying to hire first security person, right, across the board, across different domains, it is because they want to meet compliance standards like PCI, ISO, like what have you, right? If you're in the health industry, there's HIPAA. So more often than not, I've seen the first security hires responsibility is to make sure that the company meets all the compliance standards that is required by the customers, right? Because if they don't do that, there's no point building a business, right? Because customers want to see these certifications if they want
Mm.
to engage with the business. So I think that is very important as well. And now, having said that, I am not a compliance sort of a person. Like, I don't enjoy as much. I do enjoy other things, right? Like working on
Yeah.
automation and actually solving complex problems. But I know it's a huge part in a security program, and it also needs a lot of love and attention.
Yeah. So I really like your points about the 30-day stuff. I'll come back to that in a second. But you poke the compliance
Yeah.
bear, so let's talk about that,
Yeah.
right? So I think here's kind of I'm with you, right? I'm also the kind of guy who's never really had a role where I've been an owner of compliance, right? I've never played that role. But I've really come to appreciate the importance of compliance in a company. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've worked at Razorpay, which is a large fintech, very heavily regulated industry. And kind of, I think the difference between compliance and security, though there's a lot of similarities, right? I mean, a lot of what you do is kind of, the rules of the game are similar. Maybe you could say the compliance standards and don't really get it sometimes. At least that's how I feel. That there are a lot of these rules which don't really further security. But anyway, we can talk about that on a different episode. But I think the primary difference between compliance and security is this: that compliance is the cost of doing business. Right? If you're not compliant, you're out of the game in many cases, right? That's it. It's a binary. It's a 0 or 1. Now, there's a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing is if you're not compliant, it really has like a downside to your business. The good thing is ROI is very, very easy to measure, right? How many times have we seen security people say, hey, I can't convince my CFO, I can't convince the CEO why you need to invest in this new XYZ tool, right? With compliance, it's very straightforward, right? You could say, hey, 37% of a business depends on us being compliant. And if you don't have that, you can take that off your top line, right? So that way, I think I understand why CXOs, non-security CXOs also understand, it's easier for them to understand compliance, right? It's kind of like, having a license for your building, having a rental agreement, right? So those things kind of intuitively makes a lot more sense. So that's kind of one of the reasons I think also is that, it's okay to force feed security through compliance, right? I think that's one point. I think the other aspect is, that you're right. I mean, compliance, if you don't have, the problem with security is that there's no end goal in sight, right? There's no such thing as secure, right? So it's really hard to kind of think about, convincing people about what security is. When does it end? Does it ever end? We always love saying things like, oh, there's nothing called hack proof. There's nothing called 100% security. And, that sounds correct to us, but it's actually very disconcerting for a lot of non-security people. So they're like, okay, so I do everything you say, and we're still not done, like we're never done, right? That's hard. Compliance, on the other hand, is simple, right? Because you do these things, you have an audit, you get the certificate, you're done. So it's much easier to digest for like a non-security,
Yeah. And, like since we are speaking about compliance, just wanted to mention this. So I've seen 2 blog posts. One is by this company called Run Reveal. I believe, forget the name of the founder, but they basically wrote a blog about how they got SOC 2 compliance, like certified. I think SOC 2 is known to be a very difficult thing because like SOC 1 is easy, but SOC 2 is one of those things where you should know what you're doing in order to prove to your auditor that you're doing the right things, right? So I think Run Reveal, I wrote a blog about how they approach this. There was also another blog by Tom Patachek, like he's the one who wrote the I forget, like Marsano Labs founder, right? I think he worked for Fly.io and he wrote something very similar. So I think it is important to understand what is being asked when you are being asked to get SOC 2 compliance or SOC 1 compliance, right? Because I've seen people generally tend to fall in, in these holes, right? Where there's no end to it, right? They just keep going at it. And as a result of it, all other priorities go nowhere, right? So I think it's important to wear that hat and have those conversations with the auditor, showing and proving that you are doing what you're expected to do.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. So going back to the earlier point you were making on the 30, 60, 90-day plan, right? So the one trick I kind of found which was helpful is that every time you hire a security person, okay, you're the first security hire and then you have other security hires coming in the future, right? The one advantage that a security person has when they join a company is that they still have like a bit of an outside-in perspective, and that kind of goes away in 6 to 9 months, right? You're almost kind of an insider now. You know too much about the, you've seen the system for too long, so sometimes it may be hard. You may miss obvious things, right? But an outsider usually kind of first sees the most obvious part. So, as an outsider, like doing things like attack surface management stuff is very good because you're kind of thinking about the company from an outside perspective, right? But also one of the things that can help me is that every time we hired a security person in the team, not like a developer who's doing security, but like a pen tester or somebody, somebody in the SOC, etc., is that we would actually say for the first 1 week, you kind of have the license to do whatever the hell you want, non-intrusive, obviously, but we don't give you any instructions, right? So it's kind of like a 1 week consulting gig, right? Where you don't know what's happening in the company, but I just want you to kind of think of it as an outside perspective. And it's kind of fascinating that for almost 2.5 years, every time somebody new would come, they would tell us some obvious things we already knew, but there was always 1 or 2 things that we had never thought about, right? And I thought that was really interesting. So I kind of had like an unwritten rule saying every new hire spends a week without talking to us and just telling us what they have, and then they can ask questions and we'll answer the questions, but we won't give you instructions on how to go about it, right? It kind of helps them understand the company from the outside and then correlate with information that's inside, but it also kind of helps you kind of get a outside in perspective. So but I think that's a good point, right? If you have a 30, 60, 90-day plan, then you have something to kind of look forward to. It's also nice, I think, to commit to that plan and tell the world about it. Even if you don't meet it, at least the people know that you're serious about what you're doing.
Also, to add to that, right, like I think 30, 60, 90 days plan, right? I think so some things that I've seen work really well in smaller companies where, you only have a few folks on the security team is focusing on a few things, right? The first thing is to focus on an IR program, right? Like an incident response program, where if something were to happen, if you do get reported a vulnerability, whatever, there should be a proper process of how to involve legal, doing the postmortems, all of that, right? So having a good IR plan slash person who knows about it is important. I think second, having some sort of an EDR program as well, right? Endpoint detection and response. I think again, like if you don't monitor, or if you don't have any way to get visibility about your employees' workstations, I think that is almost like skeletons hidden in the closet, right? So I think having a good EDR plan is also important, right? And again, I'm not talking about like having a detailed plan, or at least having a good understanding of what are you doing about these things, right? Third thing I would mention is having some sort of a vulnerability management program, whether it is true with application security vulnerabilities, cloud security issues, right? Just kind of understanding what is out there in your external attack surface, having an understanding of your external attack surface. I think these things become important, right? So if you think about 30, 60, 90 days, you could take the first 30 days to just kind of come up with some basic processes or ways of, of doing these things that you can share with the folks, so that folks start to see the real value that you're bringing in. I don't know if you have any thoughts to that, Sandesh.
Yeah. No, I mean, I sort of agree with you on the top three things that you spoke about, right? Like EDR and all that makes sense. But I kind of feel like it changes from company to company as well, in the sense that it also so a lot of the stuff like EDR and things are things that IT teams can do pretty well as well, because it can have very vendor dependent, very easy to kind of implement. So if you have an IT team, like they may not be security folks,
Sure.
right? So the one lesson I kind of learned at Razorpay, I was not the first security hire. There was already a small compliance team, but I was the first full-time person focusing only on security. Is that while you may be the first security hire in the company, you're not the first person to think about security, right? Almost always founders, and I can tell you that now because I'm a founder now, is that founders are freaking paranoid, right? They're always worried that hard work is going to be wiped off, because of a hack or because of many other things, right? It's not just about InfoSec, the other risks as well, but in general. So I think the one thing you can also do is kind of identify what already is happening in the company from a security perspective. And then I apply the lens that you said, right? So if you're thinking of like vulnerability management, EDR, and incident response, right? If these are the three things that you think are top three for a company, the first thing would be to go figure out, hey, how is that happening today? Because somebody thought about incident response, maybe not security incident response, but I'm sure they had incidents in production. So how did they do that, right? So can you add like a security layer to it? Can you add like a security appendix to it? And can I just say, hey, everything's fine, but if it's a security incident, then these are the four things that have to be different, right? So I would just add that point, saying that you don't have to build these from scratch. If some of this already exists, all you got to do is review it and then figure out how you can improve it and get it to a level of maturity that you want to get right? But other than that, I think those three are really good. The fourth I would add, and I think you kind of implied this implicitly, is just some kind of identity and access management review, like just understanding who has access to what. Not do everything completely, but if you get a sense of these are the three crown jewels of the company, if everyone's an admin on your AWS account, if your root user does not have 2FA, like just basic hygiene stuff, maybe something to kind of think about if you're again, it'll be somewhere on a 30, 60, 90-day plan. Will it be the first thing you do or the second thing you do? Depends on where the arcs.
Yeah, absolutely. And like these things, I'm sure you could take 90 days, even a year, right? But again, like the point is to have something going and to keep hiring so that you have more support. But I'm curious to know, like, what do you think should come after this phase? So you have these basic, skeleton frameworks laid out about these different programs. You have a good understanding of how vulnerabilities are coming in, how workstations are being monitored, and just kind of the general sense of an IR program as well. Where do you go from there? Like, do you have any thoughts or opinions?
Yeah, it's a tough answer, right? Like I'll go back to my point of saying, hey, you need to talk to a lot of people and you need to understand stakeholders. If you're I usually draw this on two axes, right? So one is are you a tech heavy company or an ops heavy company? And then versus kind of just the size of the company, right? How small are you? How big are you? And stuff like that. If you're a tech heavy company, you write all your code, then your core IP and everything you do is probably more in product security and cloud security, right? It's probably the first area that I would take a crack at because it has like outsized. Again, once you fix IR, like incident response, I'm with you. Like that's kind of like number one, right?
Yeah, that
And
has
after
to
that,
happen, right?
that has to happen because you want to be able to manage fires when they happen. But once that's done, I would focus on product and cloud security. If you are if you're a company which is very tech, if you're very ops heavy, I would focus a lot more on processes like vendor management and stuff like that. If you have like sometimes, even for incident management, right? If everything you do is managed by vendors, if all your tech is managed by vendors, responding without having a good relationship with your vendors is very hard. And this is something I noticed with like seasoned CISOs, right? Neither of us are CISOs, right? I mean, we've played that role, but we're not like seasoned executives. When a seasoned CISO or a CISO, whatever you call it, joins a company, the first thing they do is they go take meetings with all their security vendors, which I thought was fascinating. Right? So obviously they're not the first security hire. There's like a whole ecosystem there. But that was to me very, very interesting, right? And I see this across execs who join. So I think if you're an ops-heavy company, understanding your supply chain and kind of figuring out, hey, how do I manage risks when they come up with it? Who are my partners that I can rely on? Who's like a weak link where I have to add more things is something I would focus on. But yeah, otherwise from a tech perspective, it's probably product security and cloud security. And then I think that's kind of where I would go next.
So just to reiterate what you said and just to make sure I understand what you said. So you're saying when a CISO joins, like this is the first time I'm hearing, but it's actually good to know as well, is when a CISO joins, and if you're an ops heavy company, the first thing that you might want to do is speak to all your vendors because you want to understand how you are managing risk when it comes to dealing with third-party vendors. Is my understanding right?
Yeah. So again, like I said, the whole CISO conversation is a little different from what you and I are currently talking about because in this case, you're the first security hire, right? So you don't have any security vendors. You maybe have like some EDR thing, but beyond that, you don't have much else, right? But for example, if you're like a end-to-end AWS shop, right? And you're spending millions of dollars every quarter on AWS, which is not unheard of if you're like a Series B, C type company, right? Depending on what your business model is. Then you really want to go build a relationship with your AWS, point of contact, because a lot of the incident management, if you're struggling with, if you're hit with the DDoS attack, knowing AWS and kind of making sure you have their support is probably going to be as important as understanding people inside the company, right? So I think depending on where the heavy lifting is done in your company, you want to make sure you build relationships. If heavy lifting is done by engineering teams, you have a very well settled DevOps team. Again, I doubt that if you're the first security hire, because if you had a very well-settled DevOps team, you probably have someone for security as well. If not, and if all of your heavy lifting is done by consultants, AWS consultants, right? Because they hired like a few AWS solutions engineers to kind of build out all their infra, then, relationship with AWS is probably as important. So I would definitely say that if you're a vendor-heavy ecosystem, then building a relationship with your vendors, understanding, who you're going to call on when something happens, who can add value for the program goals you have, is got to be critical as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that. I do have a question, right? So since we are anyways discussing the first security hire, right? Like, and I've heard virtual CISOs quite often these days, right? Where you're trying to prove to your customers that you're doing something for your security, so you just end up hiring a virtual CISO, right? So in your opinion, do you think it makes sense to hire a virtual CISO first, or do you think it makes sense to actually hire a full-time security person working in a team? Any pros, cons, because I don't have that experience and visibility, so I'm curious to know if you've had any.
I think there are two reasons why we do more security things, okay? One is to actually secure things, and the second thing is for security theater, right? And as early security engineers, you look down on security theater, but as I've spent more time in security teams, I actually kind of respect it, right? If you appear as a weak target, more hackers will hack you. Will try at least, right? And the more they try, the higher the chance of success. Success. And even if they don't succeed, you're to deal with a lot of hacker traffic and stuff like that, right? So even from a technical perspective, giving a perception that you are secured is kind of important, right? And it's doubly important if you're in regulated industries and you have to deal with stakeholders who are not just B2C customers, right? If you have large customers, if you have large businesses who are customers, if you have regulators whom you work with, if you're a multi-geography organization, then a lot of these things come in, right? If you work with Europe and you have to think about GDPR and stuff like that. So I think as far as a CISO goes, my sense is that usually is sign of like a little bit of a panic button, in the sense that you need a CISO, but you can't hire one quickly because let's face it, it's hard to hire a full-time CISO, right? So a VCISO, I
Mm.
think, is useful in two cases. One is where you want to kind of, try before you buy, right? So you kind of try to have someone on as a VCISO for 6 months, do your critical stuff, and then see if you really need someone full time. Or second, if you kind of want to assign ownership of something to someone, but it's just not big enough
Mm.
for it to be a full time job, right? Then I think it's okay to have a VCISO. But it's almost
Yeah.
always theater, right? Like, the VCISO can be called security engineer. Like, I don't know why they need to be called VCISO unless there is some
Yeah.
weight to that word CISO. And that weight
Mm.
only happens if you need them to represent them somewhere external, right? Internally, most folks don't even have the title CISO. They're either like VP or senior VP or something like that, right? Only very few companies have like internal title as CISO, but it's usually an external title, right? So by that
Yeah.
definition, I think VCISO is a role which is used to manage your external stakeholders. And if that's important for you, then it kind of makes sense to have like a VCISO. But if your goal is to kind of protect you from attacks and stuff, obviously you want someone full time because your attacks are not going to stop in 3 months. Like what happens if the
Yeah.
VCISO
Yeah.
contract expires? Your DDoS, the person buying a rig to do DDoS attacks on you is not going to stop because your contract ended with the VCISO, right? So I think that's kind of
Yeah.
where it is. So I think it comes down to motivation. Are you hiring someone to satisfy external requirements, or are you doing it because you had 3 DDoS attacks over the last 4 weeks and you're done and you need someone to manage them? Right? So then you probably want to hire
Yeah.
a founding security engineer or a principal security engineer or something.
Yeah. 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 Just one last point to
Mhm.
this topic before we can jump on to something else. So I think the in one of my previous workplaces, we had a VCISO,
Hmm.
and we had just started to build our founding security team, right? And only thing that I think the VCISO provided value with was to write up these information security policies, right? Which again, to as a company, right? You're asked like, do you have some sort of an information security data security policy or not, right? So I think that's what the company used that VCISO for. And then when we joined and we were like, what the hell is happening, right? Like, what is the VCISO doing? It was all over the place. So I think maybe, again, based on my experience working in the real world, I think that's what VCISOs are hired for. But I would like to believe that, they are a lot more skilled. Like if somebody wants them to be, others to call them CISOs or virtual CISO, whatever, I hope that they are just more skilled than writing up these long as policies that nobody really cares for, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, just wanted to
No,
add
look,
that.
I mean, like I said, there's a lot of theater in security, right? A lot of things are
Yeah.
done so you can tell people you've done them, as opposed to actually
uh,
doing them because you care about them. Hopefully, a lot of that can be replaced with ChatGPT. We'll see, right? So,
yeah. Yeah.
but I think security policies and standards are definitely a topic we should deep dive on another day. I
Yeah.
really truly care about it. In theory, not having standards makes zero sense. In reality, we rarely see standards succeed. So it's an area that I'm really, really kind of,
Me
I've
too.
thought a lot
It's
about.
a very spicy topic. Yeah.
It's a very spicy topic. It deserves a whole episode for itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. I
Yes.
think another question area I kind of want to talk to you about, and we spoke about this a little bit in the blog as well, is that, so you started your 30, 60 day, 90 plan. You kind of settled into the company. The first big challenge you'll probably face is the first meeting you'll have with your leadership, right? Where you got to provide
Mm.
updates on what's going on. So question for you is, how do you manage your, stakeholders up, like, people you report to or people who run the company, and kind of, what kind of metrics do you want to talk to them about? And I know the second one, there's no perfect answer to it. So,
Yeah.
I'm going to
Metrics
preempt all
is
the
like,
comments which says, oh, those are terrible metrics. Read this 3-volume book on how to kind of generate metrics for your company. Okay, that's fine. But how do you get started,
yeah.
right? How do you kind of, where do you start from metrics, and where do you start about talking to the board, talking to the executives and so on?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't feel confident in answering this just because I'll be the first person to admit that I haven't had too much exposure going to these meetings where I'm speaking to, like the C levels. But I think in general, what I've seen and what I've experienced is explaining the term risk to the C level is key, right? Like if your board members, if your C level suite does not understand what risk is in terms of your organization, in terms of what you're trying to explain and work on, I think it's almost going to be an epic failure of how these meetings go, right? Because again, it all comes back to you speaking in the same language, terms, using some words, whatever, right? That makes sense to these folks who don't have any idea about security. They might, but for the most part, they just want to know right? Like if in case of a breach, right, are they protected or not? What is the game plan if something were to happen, right? And what are we doing as a company in order to make sure that we reduce that risk of getting breached or whatever as much as we can, right? So I think that is the general philosophy, is what I've seen. Now, how you approach these, what kind of slides you prepare, what kind of things you present to the folks, is kind of depends on company to company, right? And same thing with metrics, right? Metrics again is, I think, a topic that can go for hours and hours. But I think as a security professional, I've always struggled personally to come up with metrics that A, is kind of easy to calculate and show meaningful progress, and then B, you are actually confident about whatever metrics you're reporting is not something that you're just doing it for the sake of it, but you actually care for it and you think there is value in it, right? And I at least haven't, in the 13 years or so of my working, haven't come to a good conclusion of what are some of the basic metrics that would apply to all organizations in all cases. I have
Yeah.
seen some talks about this recently. I can link to in the post notes, but yeah, that's been my experience. I'm curious to know what your experience
Yeah.
has been.
No, I think you're right. Right. There's lots to unpack on what you said there, right? So first,
Yeah.
So first on the whole, what is the risk aspect and everything? You're right, right? I mean, I think a lot of the job, it's very weird, right? When you get hired as the first security engineer, you assume you want to impress the people above you, or I mean, whatever above means, right? I mean, the people who you report to, or the CISO executives, etc. But if you're the first hire, then a lot of the work you have is actually education, right? It's actually about educating these executives who are otherwise very smart but haven't really spent a lot of time working on security, right? So I think it's as much education as it is impressing them and providing an update on what you are doing, right? So I think you're right. The first thing to do is kind of define what risk means for the company and how we're going to manage it. What are we going to do if there's an incident, and so on and so forth. I'm with you on that. The couple of nuances I'll add there is, one is that if you can tie it to the metrics that they truly care about, that's always helpful, right? So if, for example, if availability is like a core metric for the company, then tie risk to availability, right? There is a lot of availability risk, which is security related as well. So, if compliance is like a key thing, then tie what you're doing to compliance, right? So in general, contextualize your message to what you are doing is very, very important. And I kind of learned this trick back in my consulting days in Synopsys, where I used to work with with the sales team. Right, I was like the counterpart for the sales team, and it's always that you sell the same freaking product. Like we had 4 products, right? But every customer pitch was slightly different, because they would kind of figure out what they did. And the really, really good salespeople, what they would do is if it was a public company, they would go read their annual report first. Right? They would read their annual report, figure out what the CEO really cares about, because they know the CISO kind of reports to the CTO, the CTO reports to the CEO. So, if they're saying we're going to do digital transformation in 2019, right? Then you got to go talk about digital transformation and what security means for that, right? So that was a really neat trick, right? Which is to say that talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm not saying that you should talk about what they want to hear about, but you want to contextualize it to what they care truly about, right? And that was a really neat trick, and I think that kind of worked well for me. So executives give you hints about this all the time. Look at what they talk about in your all hands, right? Think about what company updates they send out. What is the company talking about on in public, right? And that'll give you a hint about what they really care about. And as you learn more about it, tying risk back to risk of what, okay, I think is kind of helpful. But on metrics, I'm 100% in agreement with you, okay? I think every security person shames every other security person on the metrics they track. No matter what metric you have, there will be one school of thought, which basically says that kind of metric is wrong. So I have a very simple test. I'm like, is the metric useful? That's it, right? And now you'll say, oh, but what does useful really mean? And I understand that, right? But I think obsessing over metrics, I think no metrics and some metrics has a massive improvement, right? And from some metrics to some useful metrics is like a massive improvement again. And then it kind of becomes like, it's like linear, right? I mean, the amount of improvement you make metric over metric with new metrics that come in is not that high, right? So my thought always was that make sure you track something that people care about and that it actually has an impact on security. So that can be the number of incidents you had, the number of potential incidents which never converted into incidents and things like that. And then stick to it, right? Give month on month the same metrics until you have a reason to believe that this metric is useless, right? And iterate over time, right? So I think it's very important to say if you track 3 metrics today in this month, if your next monthly update is 3 other metrics and the next monthly update is 3 other metrics, then no one's knowing if you're getting better or worse, right? Because it's so hard to calculate ROI in security in general, and the only real outcome is when you get hacked. That's the only true outcome, right, of security. So I think it's very hard to kind of make sure that you, for the first few months, it's okay if you're kind of changing around your metrics till you find your feet. But once you get a metric which you're happy with and your execs also are happy with, track the exact same thing over and over again, because then you get like a time series graph. Then you get a fact. If you're tracking open vulnerabilities in products, right? If that's kind of if you decide that's a metric that's useful for whatever reason, right? Then track the same thing every month, and then 6 months later you say, hey, it was 55 today, it became 64, then it became 32, then and then it became 11. Okay, so then your discussions become, hey, what did we do right? Why did it become 64 to 32? Is it because we stopped testing and we fired all our pen testers, or is it because development teams scared and started fixing things? Right. So then that becomes the narrative, right? Not about why are you tracking, what are you tracking. So I think consistency in tracking is important. And the final point I'll say, you made an excellent point about sometimes it being hard to track stuff, is that it's okay to do it manually when you start, but eventually you have to get to a point where real-time data is available whenever you need. It's not that you have a meeting on the 10th and on the 9th evening you scramble to get this data. I would highly recommend publishing this data every day and talking about it once a month, right? But you should publish it every day. It should be very easy to access. This is not something that you should hide and not show people, right? It should be available to whoever needs to see it all the time.
Yeah, I'm feeling like, each of these things that we are discussing for the first security hire probably needs its own episode, because metrics again is I have so many thoughts and opinions. So I will save these for our podcast episode when we do talk about metrics in detail. So yeah, let's jump on to the next thing. So speaking about first security hire, right? One other thing that comes to my mind, and one thing that I've experienced, is the ability to wear multiple hats, right? So let's say again, you're the first security hire, right? Your scope might be limited to just product or application security or incident response, but I think for the first security hire, generally, the tendency is to hire, so to speak, a generalist, right? Where you could be asked to work on multitude of things, right? So I think that is really important, because I think it gives you opportunities to learn about things that you might not be comfortable about, right? You're just thrown in, like the fire, and you just have to keep, at it, right? So I think that is one thing that I really feel helped me in my career, is being able to, just having an open mind and just kind of trying to deal with it as it comes, right? Trying to learn on the job. Some people I know are not comfortable with this, right? Like they have their expertise areas and they want to stick to those areas. But I think if you really want to grow, and if you're the first security hire, and if you have a good aspiration, whatever, right, of becoming a CISO someday, I think it is really important for you to be able to explore all these other areas as well. So, I've had the chance to work with infrastructure, cloud, automation, incident response, and I've seen that those experiences have helped me at various different places. So, anything to share along those lines, Sandesh?
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with you, right? And I think especially if I think you and I both followed an arc where we started with AppSec and then we became a little more generalist, right? So I think for folks like us, and I know it happened to me for sure, is like I had a massive imposter syndrome when I started saying, hey, I know AppSec, I know nothing about security operations, right? Like, so please don't let me, like, I can't do SOC, I can't do SIEM, I can't do incident response. This is not things I've done, right? But the message I have for everyone out there is that for anyone outside our industry, security itself is super niche already, right? And then to say, oh, but I'm a security person, but I'm not a cloud security person. I'm an AppSec person, but I'm an AppSec defensive person. So I can't do pen testing. All I can do is configure SaaS tools. That just sounds absurd to people outside the industry, right? And that's one, right? So when you're in the first security hire, you can't tell people that because they won't even get what you say. And the second thing is, I would urge people to kind of shed the imposter syndrome and just go for it, right? Because at least what I learned is that as much as I always thought, hey, I can't do this, I'm not qualified for this, I'm not a XYZ security person, is that honestly, the first principles are kind of the same, right? It doesn't change that much, right? So whether you're doing security operations or cloud security or AppSec or building an incident response team, there are certain things about security which are similar. And if you're good at one, you can pick up the other. So the two things I would say is that don't be afraid of taking on more more in your job and trying new things, and know that the question really you should be asking is not if you're amazing at this new thing that you're trying to do, but is it, are you the best person within the company to do that? So let's say you're an AppSec person and you don't want to look at security operations stuff because you have no idea how that works. The question is, if you're not doing it, either nobody is doing it, or like a DevOps person is doing it, right? So the question is that what is better for the company? If it's really, if security operations is really important for the company and you determine that, and if that's a P0, then yeah, roll up your sleeves and get it done. So like, and again, if you are good at one part of security, you will be able to learn others, right? So I think my only suggestion is just be bold and try it, because it'll probably work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Okay. So one aspect I think I kind of want to talk to you especially about is just in general, like work-life balance stuff, right? Because when you're in one corner of AppSec, like if you're in a large company and you're digging deep into one area, I think, I'm not saying life is easy. Of course, life is hard, and there's going to be a lot of things to learn, and you can go into the minutiae of things, and you have teams to manage different things, etc. But if you're the only security person, you are the on-call, and you're the strategy, and you're the tactics, and you're the external facing person, and you're everything. How the hell do you think about managing life? When you're in that start.
Yeah, man, that's a question that I'm still trying to figure out the answer to. I think this is something I really struggle with, to be honest, completely honest, right? And especially post COVID, even pre COVID. So I've actually been working remotely from home even before COVID. So when COVID happened, it was the same to me. Like life didn't change much for me and my family, right? But what changed was everybody else, the way they worked, like everything changed. Everybody became remote, right? So now that I've had this experience of working from home for, I don't know, for the past 6 years or so, right? I tend to think I've slightly figured out, but it is still a work in progress, right? But again, uh, what I'm trying to say is, I think, especially if you're the first security hire, again, sticking to our like episode main crux, of being the first security hire, I've had instances where there was an incident, or I was looking into something, it's past like 5 p.m. and I just kept working until I've reached a point where, because again, like if you are the only person trying to work on something, you don't have anybody to report to. You don't have anybody to, share ideas, take feedback from. You're the only one, right? And if the company culture is such that it's okay if you want to work after hours, I've worked in places where even if my manager saw that I was working after hours, it was okay. Like he was okay with it because I was passionate about what I was doing. I didn't have a problem. He didn't have a problem either, right? So again, the organization culture plays an important part here and how your managers are. But I think it is really easy to fall into this rut of, just trying to solve problems after problems, kind of approach projects after projects if you're the first security hire. So I think one thing I've tried to establish that has helped me is having like a separate space for work, and then separate space for all the other things, right? So like where I'm right now, this is my office, right? When I'm in the office, I work. As I step out of the office, I just stop working completely. I don't even take my laptops. I used to do this, I used to take my laptop everywhere, like inside my house, and that was a recipe for disaster, right? So I think this is a topic that people need to pay more attention to, right? Mental health, work life balance, right? Like, and we are talking about these things because this is important, and especially if you're the first security person, or if you're just the first engineer, I think it is very important. And I don't hear folks speaking about it often. So
I agree with you, and I think everyone's way of dealing with it is going to be different, but it's important to think about it. I think in your blog you spoke a little bit about prioritization. Do you think that kind of helps get your work-life balance? Because like you said, you're never going to be 100%, you're never going to finish everything. So if you just keep thinking, hey, 8 hours a day, I can't do everything, 16 hours a day, that is the recipe for finishing everything that's insecure. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? So how do you think about like prioritization from this perspective?
I mean, to be honest, based on my experiences, when you are the first hire and when it's a small company, everything is of the utmost priority. So I struggled with figuring out which gets the most priority, right? At times, I've had to rely on my team, on my manager to sort of give me the direction as to, like this is the priority. Because again, if you if you are trying to build empathy, or if you're trying to approach security, using empathy as your key thing, right? Like everybody's problems are important, and if you don't pay attention to everybody's problem, then you're not really building empathy, right? So I think, yeah, you can prioritize, sure, all you want, but at the end of the day, right, you also have to prioritize yourself, your mental health, right? And I think that's where I struggle the most is, if something is on fire and if my family needs me, it's okay. My family gets the priority. So again, like if you're talking about priorities between work and life, I think previously it used to be work, but I think of late I've transitioned it to be more family life, because I think
Yeah.
that is more important.
No, I think you're right. Right. I mean, I think that's fair. I also would say that if depending on what stage of life you're in, being the first
Yeah, that
security
is very
engineer,
true.
being the first security engineer in a company may not be the right fit for you, right? I mean,
Yeah,
because
that's
it
a good
does call
point.
for some amount of flexibility, right? I mean, it's unfair, if your whole, if there's a massive security incident going on, it's very, very hard for you to go and say, hey, life is important, right? I mean, you can say it, and I think people may understand, but it's just not set up yet for that kind of rigor, right? So if you're the first security
Yeah,
engineer, you want to think about, hey, do I have the flexibility in my life? And as someone who's worked for the last 15 years, I know for a fact that there were times in my life where if I left work at 5, all I'm doing is still thinking about work. So it doesn't really
yeah,
matter.
dude,
so
every
so at
time.
that
Yeah,
point, I might as well have a job where I can give more hours, or I can be super flexible. And there were definitely times in my life, when I had a kid for the first time, etc., when I wanted my weekends back, when I wanted my nights, and I wanted a set schedule, right? And it kind of
yeah,
made a lot
yeah,
of sense, right? So I think you should also like definitely kind of think about where in life you are before kind of taking this
yeah,
plunge, right? This job is not for everyone. And even within
yeah,
that, even if this job is for you, it may not be the right job for you at that time, right? So something to think
yeah,
about. It's very challenging. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it. I know you mentioned that you really enjoyed it as well, but you should definitely think about, if the timing is correct to take such a role. Um, Okay, so I had one last question for you, right? Which I think is really kind of the thing that security folks love talking about, which is on tools. Like, which are the 4,500 tools which should you buy the day you join as the first security engineer?
yeah, man. And again, everybody you speak to about this will have their own opinions and whatnot. But my the way I go about it is, use open source as much as possible, right? Because uh, getting the right budget approved for the right tool, is one aspect of this whole thing, right? The other
Yeah.
aspect is getting the tools to work the way you want it to work, and to actually start showing you value, right? Because almost all of the shelf commercial tools, they do require some kind of configuration, implementation, fine tuning, etc., etc., right? And at least I have ended up spending more time in configuring these commercial tools and not really seeing value out of it, right? As compared to, I just take something open source, do a quick run with it, and at least I have some idea, right? So um you know i I mean, we can name some vendors, right? But I think what I'm trying to point out is that I think, as a first security hire, right, you should first figure out the problems which we've spoken about, right? Like organization, people, processes, priorities, um, risk, right? All of those things. And then you sort of prioritize what is important, right? So obviously reducing risk is going to be important, right? But how are you going to do that?
Mm.
Via different programs, via different, like tools. And then you figure out, okay, what are some of the options in these categories? So again, to give you an example, right, I'm a big fan of like SEMREP. You've seen me
Yeah.
blog about
Both
SEMREP
of us.
as well, and I'm sure you
Yeah.
also played with it, right?
Yeah.
I think SEMREP is really cool. It is, they are trying to build a commercial product of it as well, but the open source CLI works just fine. It is an awesome tool where you can write custom rules, right? You can run it across the code base, across multiple repositories, and get quick feedback results on the PR. You can do various sorts of customizations, right? So something like SEMRIP, right, which gives you the flexibility of doing your own thing, as well as being able to deploy wherever you want. I think those are the kind of solutions I tend to look for. Things that have good API integrations, right?
Mm.
Things that you can just deploy without having to fine tune a whole bunch, right? And again, this is just for like AppSec product security, right? For EDR stuff, I've heard
Yeah.
good things about, like Sentinel One, and like there's different kind of things, right? So yeah, to each his own basically, and it kind of really depends on how much money you have also.
True.
But I think you can do quite a lot with just open source tools.
Yeah.
That's been my experience.
No, I think that's fair. I think that you gave a really good overview of kind of how you thought about it. I think that makes sense. For me, I think I kind of think frameworks first. Right. So I kind of
Hmm.
have like a build versus buy framework. I'll post the blog on the show notes. Right. So
Yeah.
for again, like unfortunately for me, everything has to be a framework. Right. So kind of I kind of think on those things. Right. But you're right. I mean, I think focusing on configurable open source tools is kind of useful. The one point I will make is that within security, especially for this particular decision, right? There are two kinds of tools. One which can help you with better productivity and kind of make it easier for you to get stuff done. And the second thing is where outside in perspective is absolutely critical, right? So if you have a threat intel tool, it has to be outside in. Like the whole idea is, hey, I want intel about what's happening in the world, and if that's
Mhm.
applicable for my company, right? You can't build that in house, right? It's just not something that you can do, right? So if you have to buy a threat intel feed or even subscribe to open source ones, you have to just do that, right? But whereas on the other hand, if you're like I said, going back to the other framework, the engineering versus ops framework, right? If you have access to really good engineers in your company who are very good at quick tooling, then maybe there are certain open source tools you can take very quickly and get it done. Make it work very, very quickly, right? On the other hand, if you're very ops heavy, you really know how to manage vendors, and your company is kind of very, very good at that, then maybe it's okay to kind of go rely on a few vendors to kind of help you do stuff, right? So I think again, depending on where you are, I think what you are talking about is basically a company which is engineering heavy, which is what Razorpay was where I worked as well. And we took the
Hmm.
exact approach that you mentioned, right? So
Yeah.
we did some grep. We tried every open source tool possible, and we had a rule that we'll only buy tools when we badly need support. So if you need someone to call,
Yeah.
something went wrong, right? That's the only time we
Yeah.
would buy it. And then we kind of modified that rule to say, hey, wherever we need like outside in perspective, like for example, if you need a third party pen test, it has to be third party. You can't build that in house. Kind of
Yeah.
beats the whole purpose, right? And
Yeah.
if you need like threat intel tools or where you need information about the world, that's kind of where we would bring it. So I think what you said kind of makes complete sense to me.
I mean, I do want to point out that, having said that, and, like, I have this special love for open source because I have also contributed to the open source community. I think having said that, I think it's also important. So, like you mentioned, right, build versus buy. Like, it doesn't have to be open source tools all the time. If there is a commercial tool out there that solves exactly what you're looking to,
Yeah.
solve for, I think why not? So yeah, I think having a framework, so like you mentioned, would definitely help. And yeah, please do share what your framework
Yeah.
is.
And to be honest, like everything else you said in this podcast, like every question that we've got on build versus buy
Yeah,
is another
it's
2 hour conversation,
yeah,
right? I mean, but you're right. I think as when you start out, you don't want to spend all your time fighting battles with procurement. Right? So from that
yeah,
perspective, the quicker you can onboard tools, the better, and the less friction you want to have, the better. And open source is a great way to do that. Just given that there's almost no friction to kind of start using open source tools if you're a first security
yeah,
buyer. Awesome. This is
yeah.
great. Anything else you wanted to add before we wrapped up? I think we kind of covered a lot of things. I'll go over and
Yeah.
summarize it. But before that, any last thoughts that you want to add?
No, man, I think yeah, I'm looking forward to your summarizing whatever. Yeah,
Yeah. No, I think so. So just to very quickly summarize, right? I think the first thing we spoke about is just like understanding our culture and kind of mapping your security culture to that. Whether that's by building relationships with the right people or just understanding how the company works is really, really critical. Then we kind of spoke a little bit about how compliance is kind of a thing that you have to tackle. If you're the first security engineer, you're looked at as compliance and security and product security and cloud security and everything, and you can't just like ignore that, right? So that's something you should really care about. We spoke about how incident response and some kind of endpoint protection is probably the first thing you should do if your company doesn't have it already, as just like it's almost like insurance policies, if something goes wrong. Right, and then you can kind of focus on the areas to focus on would be depending on how your company is. If you're an ops heavy company, very heavily dependent on vendors for most things, you probably want to do a lot of vendor management stuff. If you're an engineering heavy company, maybe focus a lot more on product and cloud security. And then we kind of spoke about talking to executives, selling to them, convincing them, educating them, and kind of learning from them and understanding what kind of metrics will work, right? I think our conversation there was inconclusive on what metrics work best, but the idea is start somewhere, iterate over time, and as long as your company is okay with it, don't worry about what the security community on LinkedIn says are the best metrics. Right? And then I think we spoke a little bit about work-life balance on kind of how this is not the easiest gig in the world, and it's definitely one of the most exciting ones. But this definitely needs flexibility, and you got to think about life as well, and also kind of think about prioritization whenever you can. And finally, we spoke about tools. We kind of spoke about how open source may be a good solution, simply because it kind of lets you focus on the solution very quickly. And then we spoke about a few tools, which we both really enjoy using. Okay. Did I miss anything?
No, I think the 30, 60, 90 days, we spoke about those things a little bit. And then the fact that, as a first security hire, you have to wear multiple hats. So, yeah, but everything else I think you covered. So I think we're good.
Okay. Do you have anything to wrap up with? Do you have like one thing that you thought about this week which was interesting? Do you have anything to talk about this week?
Didn't think, but I actually saw, OpenAI released Sora. I'm sure you've
that was
seen
my
it,
thing too.
right?
But anyway.
Yeah, man. No,
Go ahead,
it's
go ahead.
Gen
Go
AI.
ahead.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna. I just keep getting mind blown, right? Like Gen AI, and since I'm working for a company that is also starting to explore these Gen AI implementations, things are moving at a really fast pace, and I'm scared. Like I'm happy and sad happy because I know I'll have a job. Still, I'll continue having a job because this needs some security eyes as well. And then sad because like people can make videos out of freaking statements. That's crazy, man. So yeah, that's what I have for today.
I kind of have. I disagree with you slightly on the risks, right? So if you thought about it, like I started doing a little bit of photography around 2008, 2009. And Photoshop was a thing then, but it was very expensive, very hard to do. Filters wasn't easy. And most people had just started uploading photos on social media or whatever, right? And, the first thing we would do is every time a picture comes up, you would wonder if it's Photoshopped, but you would by default assume it's a real photo, right? And then you would wonder, hey, this sounds too good to be true, right? But cut to like, let's say 2019, 2020, where, camera phones are amazing. Cameras in phones are mostly software now. They're not really that much about the hardware. And then, Instagram and filters coming in, everything. You almost kind of appreciate, like pictures have almost become not like a record of truth, but almost like art, right? So it's like a painting, right? You can draw whatever you feel like. So you can almost, photographers actually talk about making pictures. They don't talk about taking pictures anymore, because their idea is you first take something, that's your baseline, and then you can improve it. And then you work on it, right? So by default now, when I look at a picture, I don't use that as proof for stuff. It's just a piece of art, right? And I kind of feel like, and it's almost come to the point where nobody uses pictures. I mean, not nobody, but you the moment you look at a picture, you have some kind of skepticism in your head on whether it's real or not. And I think that's about to have to happen to videos, right? Like videos are going to be expressions of of the video takers or publishers' impressions, and not the truth, right? And I think as that happens, things will get better. Definitely in the short term, it's going to be different. Definitely each society will adopt at a different pace. I think there are like some 40 elections happening in the world today. I don't want to be in the business of kind of figuring out if a video was true or fake. Like that's going to be really, really hard to do, at least in the short term. But in the medium to long term, I hope that people will just develop an instinct of figuring out, hey, of skepticism more than instinct on if this is a real video or not. So it's great for art. I think it reduces the amount of time it takes to create videos and stuff. But definitely, for things like law enforcement, for things authenticity of videos, of a speech a politician gave.
Fakes.
Yeah, for deepfakes, it's going to be deep troubles, right?
Man, I've seen some deepfake videos. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. No, that's crazy. Since you stole my thing that I wanted to talk about.
Sorry.
There's another thing which was interesting, and I will link to the paper in the show notes as well. Is that there was a paper recently on how autonomous hacking agents. Did you see that? Essentially, they were able to build agents which kind of scan the OWASP top 10 type things. But basically, it's like, hey, I can tell it, right? And it essentially said something like 60%. Again, I don't want to quote numbers because I don't have the paper open in front of me. But essentially, if you think about like a CSRF or an XSS or a SQLi, and hey, you can build an agent which just kind of solves stuff, right? And I was very, I've also like spoken to someone who's kind of trying to build something in that space, so I've thought a little bit about it. And I think I thought that was a really interesting paper. I'm going to write something about it hopefully in the next few days. But I think the way I look at it is that non-security people always fall into this trap of benchmarking against the OWASP top 10 or WebGoat or a slightly vulnerable application. And everybody in security who spend a lot of time knows that, the OWASP top 10 is a great resource it's a great education resource. It's not a benchmarking tool, right? It's where you start if you want to think about something. It's security or something, right? But just in general, like, anybody who reads the paper, worries that, hacking agents are around the corner. Maybe they are not, but this is not it. Right? I mean, there's a whole section on complicated SQL injection attacks with like, hey, if you know the username and password and you can do 1 = 1, then you can do SQL injection. And I'm like, man, there are like 14 assumptions there that are just not true for most real world scenarios. So I like the paper. I like where they're going with it, but I don't think we've solved for autonomous hacking agents yet. LLMs are useful for hacking, but we don't have autonomous agents yet. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's like a different flavor to it as well, right? So I know Jay Haddix or Jason Haddix, who is a friend of mine. He recently started his own company, Arcanum Security, and I just want to plug him in here because I know he's been working on this SecGPT bot or the app in the ChatGPT app store, and I've not played with it myself, but I think the idea there is to automate as much reconnaissance or like just kind of the steps that you would rather have somebody else do it, and you would rather have somebody orchestrate as well, right? So yeah, I think they're different flavors of what you're speaking about, right? Like the whole autonomous agents, but I think like the real autonomous agent that knows exactly what to go for, how to go for. I think there's still a ways to it, but I think there are different flavors of it that you can definitely build using an LLM. So
absolutely. I think LLM is useful for pen testing, ethical hacking, and bad hacking, like black hat hacking. Yeah, the answer is yes. There's no question about it. But I think there's a reason why everything's a co-pilot or an assistant or a chat thing, because that's what it's really good at, right? It's really good at taking you from 0 to 60, 0 to 70 very quickly, right? But what you need for pen testing or for hacking is that it's a needle in a haystack thing, right? You got to get that one thing for that particular context, for that particular scenario. And that's kind of where I think, like I said, I have no doubts that we're going to have autonomous hacking agents sometime in the future. Just don't think we're there yet, based on based on the paper I read. But it was interesting, kind of the way they approached it. One of the interesting things they did say, which I thought was pretty cool, is how cheap it is to do this. I think they spent something like not even a few hundred, like less than $100 to do all this, which is kind of impressive, right? So if the tech catches up, it's going to come to a point where you don't have to spend a lot of money to do this, right? So the entry barrier to black hat hacking is going to go down dramatically. In a way, it's good for security because it reduces the cost of testing as well. But the whole cat and mouse thing continues, right? So
continues, for sure, man.
All right, awesome. I think this has been longer than we thought. So, but thank you so much for joining, Anshuman. Thank you for listening. Okay. Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.